The following episode was originally recorded for a private podcast as part of the Equip for Life course. It has been edited for public release, but may reference training material from the Equip for Life course.
So anyway, today's podcast is about the video which kind of went viral in the pro-life community. And one of the main reasons it went viral was because James Franco's reaction is a little priceless. There are lots of there are lots of great memes of like his face screenshotted, very confused look. So I want to talk about James Franco because you know, I've seen a couple of his movies. I think like everyone has seen at least one of his. People know about him. He's a pretty big star.
He's in the original Spider-Man movies.
The original Spider-Man movies. He was in like what's the Wizard of Oz one he was in? I don't remember what it was called.
I didn't see that.
Something like that. That was a pretty big blockbuster hit. When I was in college, I had a friend who went to Yale for her undergrad, and she was an English major. While she was at Yale, her professor kind of like sat her class down and said, "We're having a new GSI come in," which is a graduate student instructor, "and we're going to have you all sign confidentiality like agreements, essentially. Wow. You're not allowed to take pictures in class. You're not allowed to record in class. If you freak out when your GSI walks through the door, you will be expelled from my class. This is no joke." Like, this is like Yale professor, like no messing around, straight-faced. Wow. Yes, James Franco was the GSI. So the girls, she's like, "Everyone freak out now. You're not allowed to freak out when he gets here." So, because I don't remember what degree. Yeah, James Franco was getting a graduate degree from Yale. I don't remember what he was studying there or what, but he was doing English. All of the girls are like going nuts. They're being, you know.
I love that she told them who it is. Like, get it out of your system. Freak out now.
Oh yeah.
Oh my
Well,
God,
you know.
James Franco.
That's hilarious.
I mean, Dave Franco is the more attractive brother. Everyone knows that. So I think it would have been a better.
I don't even know who Dave Franco is. So not everyone knows that.
He's the more attractive brother for sure.
I feel so not culturally relevant right now. Like, I don't know what this Wizard of Oz movie that you referenced earlier. I was like, what are you talking about?
But anyway, so everyone's super excited to meet him. They're all going to play it cool because they've worked really hard to get to Yale. And he comes in, and my friend, her expectations were pretty high, and they dropped and dropped and dropped over the semester. Because from her perspective, he's a weirdo. Okay, so she thinks he's really weird, and she would say like different things he would do. Like, I think he had to put on a bunch of weight for some role. So first of all, he came in, she said he kind of looked like a bum. He did not look like a movie star. And the way that he drank water out of bottles of water was like from the side of his mouth in a very weird way. She said it was like the strangest thing. Yeah, very strange. So at the end of like the class, they allowed them to take a group picture. And this was like our only proof that like she was not making this all up, you know. But in the group picture, like all the friends, all the classmates are like crowded around him, and she's like off to the side looking really grumpy because she like didn't want to be in the picture. And so that's the story of James Franco, you know, behind the scenes, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if he's actually, you know, probably he's a pretty cool dude, but we'll see. We never know.
Is this a violation of a non-disclosure agreement?
I don't think so. I think she's allowed to talk about. I didn't decide a disclosure agreement. I'm not naming her by name.
just as another comment before we get into it, I feel a certain kind of like, I don't know, like brotherhood or something with James Franco for the face that he makes. That's so memeable. Because I think that I make the same face. I think he and I have the same problem with our face that I've talked about in many a speech. Where it's like, I'll tell people, okay, so you got to think about what is your facial expressions doing, and you should ask people that you trust, like, okay, do I look weird when I talk to people? And I happen to know that I look weird when I talk to people because we take pictures, and the picture of me in conversation almost always looks exactly the same. This weird kind of furrowed brow. Yeah. Yes. And that's my thinking face. That's what I look like when I'm thinking hard, when I'm really listening, and it just comes off really intense and weird. And I think James Franco was not actually as incredulous as he looks. But he, as an actor, should know better. He should be in better control of what his face is doing.
We should upload a Dropbox folder of like all of the pictures from one of our hours. So you can see, like, for every good picture of Tim, there's like 5 or 6 that no one will ever see. And it's us, dude. Jacob looks so mean when I take pictures. He's the nicest guy I know. And I'm like, Jacob, you have to smile or else you look so mad. And he's the nicest, happiest, most positive one on our staff.
Yeah.
We all need to be careful about our body language. But if you've got cameras on you and you're taking video so you can encourage people to get excited about philosophy,
try to smile.
I think you should especially be aware of that. I appreciate what James Franco is doing here. So I feel bad. Like, I haven't yet taken the time to watch the other philosophy time videos. But I kind of like that he's going around, like, I don't know what his background is or who the guy next to him is, but I kind of like that they're going out and they're trying to make kind of hip philosophy videos. Like, I thumbs up to the guy. I think it's pretty cool.
I think it was in the Matt Anderson piece about this whole video, or he said, he's like introducing it, and James Franco and so made this video. Yes, that James Franco. Kind of acknowledging it's a little bit weird, but like, hey, by all means, go for it. Let's try and get people talking about good ideas, and let's not punish them so harshly. Maybe.
Yeah. I feel bad. Like, they've uploaded this thing and it's got like 80% thumbs down on YouTube. It's like the poor guy. Like,
I think they are somewhat to blame for that, but we'll get there.
Yeah. There's blame to go around, but I think some people have been too harsh to James Franco.
Certainly.
All right. So let's talk about the James Franco video.
So there was blood in the water, and everyone wanted to jump on it. Yeah, I think my first reaction when I saw the memes coming out, I saw, I have a lot of pro-life people on social media, and I was like, I have to watch this video. What's going on?
Right.
And I was thinking about other, I guess, pro-choice arguments and, other things people say about pro-choice people that is in a similar boat. And it's like, whenever we encounter something that seems ridiculous on face value, as a general community, I don't think we react very well.
No.
It's definitely not a, is this person actually an idiot? Or are they maybe trying to say something but not saying it as well as they could?
Right.
I will 100% agree with anyone that says this video is confusing and that this professor looks very odd in this video. Like, the way she speaks is so baffling. It's definitely like blood in the water for sure.
Yeah. And so because of that, like, to some extent, we got to give some slack to the pro-life community, kind of blood in the water, jump on her, because she ought to know better than to have spoken that unclearly. I would argue she shouldn't have chosen this as an argument to talk about in a 5-minute video.
Yeah.
It's so confusing. Like all three of us, we read her actual paper. Like, we put a lot of time into figuring out, okay, what is she saying here? Because it's really confusing when you're reading her like 15-page paper.
Yeah.
In a 5-minute video, and with the kind of attitude that people come to social media with, there's no way anyone was going to understand it from that context. Yeah. Even if she had explained it really well, and she didn't. But even if she had explained it really well, it still would have been completely misunderstood given that medium.
Yes.
It's just not the right kind of argument to do in a 5-minute video.
Yeah.
It's a hard argument to talk about in a, I don't know, what is this going to be, a 90-minute podcast or something?
At least.
Like, even that it's difficult because what she's doing is so peculiar, but not entirely stupid, at least not all parts of it. And so I think, like, on one hand, I want to defend the pro-life community at some level for, like, this is really a criticizable thing, and she shouldn't have done this, and she's got a lot of the blame. But I think what you're saying, Rachel, the extent to which we as a community just like want to jump on things is a problem. And that also connects with my general concerns about social media right now. I've been kind of depressed about social media lately. And like, that kind of context really naturally encourages people to be really quick to criticize and really quick to share and mock and that kind of thing.
But
Tim, and we as a community of pro-lifers ought to be better. We should be trying to take people seriously and be charitable.
But Tim,
yes, Josh.
This is not Josh. This is not Josh. I'm playing some other dude.
Yes, Joe?
There you go. This is a war of ideas. Of course we have to jump on things when they come out. Like, there was only a short window of time because people are ADHD all the time on social media. Anyway, there's only a couple of days that people are going to talk about this. So we had to jump on it. And this person went out and made this clearly stupid argument. Of course we should jump on it. It was one of our best chances as a pro-life movement to jump on a pro-choice philosopher's argument.
Are you utilitarian?
I don't know what that is.
So I think that it is not justifiable morally to distort someone's views and mock them based on a straw man, even if you have positive benefits that come from it. And I think it is extremely questionable whether you actually have positive benefits coming from it. There's kind of a pro-life moment in the sun, ha ha ha, look at the silly pro-choice professor thing that like we all feel really great about. What do you think pro-choice people felt watching all the mockery, like us dancing around in circles, like ha ha ha, we're smarter than Princeton professors? Right. I don't think that was actually a good moment for us. I think we lost ground with the people that we're trying to convince.
Yeah, I very much agree.
I think the area where we're going to gain the most ground, what we're actually going to accomplish as a movement, is when we stop saying that pro-choice people are dumb and start saying that they're wrong and explain why. Yes. Because that's actually persuasive. So if we would have taken a moment and said, okay, this woman is wrong and here's why. And when we encounter that in a conversation, what we need to do so we can get there is ask clarification questions. With a video online, you don't have that opportunity. And so instead, we have the alternative of reading her paper or talking about it with a, person who also understands philosophy and, what do you think she's trying to say here?
Yeah. So I first found the video I see it from like a pro-life person's Facebook page. I found it that day because it went viral on Reddit. And so I watched it with no, I didn't even know what it was going to be. It just I think it just said, James Franco talks about abortion. I was like, that sounds interesting.
That's interesting enough to watch.
I'm in. And then, I watched the thing, and I think here's where I'm going to give the most slack to the pro-life movement is a lot of the things that I've seen pro-lifers, the ones who aren't just ad hominem her, like the counter arguments that I've seen pro-lifers give on videos and Facebook and things like that, are some of the things that I thought when I first watched the video. Mm-hmm. I was confused by her argument. I had this distinct impression of this seems awfully circular.
It definitely has the appearance of circularity.
That was my reaction. I didn't think she was an idiot. I thought she was really interesting and was clearly doing something different than I've seen anyone else try to do on the pro-choice side. But it certainly seemed circular. I wasn't coming away with wow, this is a fantastic pro-choice argument. But I also did not say one word on Facebook. And I didn't because I wasn't confident enough that I really was fully understanding her argument. Now, I didn't have time to go read the paper that day, or is the next day, because I saw it that night, that it went viral. I didn't go and read the paper. So my Facebook feed started filling up with all these pro-lifers, being all kind of culturally relevant and talking about what's going on right now. And I just had to, and was kind of frustrated about it, but just had to kind of be silent because I did not have the confidence that and I feel like I'm fairly good at philosophy, but I'm not trained in it. But it's I'm not that confident that I'm fully tracking with what she's trying to say. And until I am, whether that's through reading the paper a bunch of times or finding other really good trusted sources to go to about this, I'm just not going to say anything about it. And this is going to sound a lot like virtue signaling, but I kind of wish more people did that. I'm not saying no one should be talking about this paper. I think people should be talking about this paper. I think there were some really good articles that were written about this paper, but a lot of the frustration that I'm feeling is with what happened when a whole bunch of people made very strong statements about about her and her argument without going to the trouble of reading the paper. And I don't know. Like, I feel a bit conflicted because I feel like if everyone does what I did, then no one says anything. I don't want to say that. I don't want to say everyone's got to shut up on social media. And I also don't want to make the bar too high. Like, you have to read all of, like all thousands of pages of Trump care or Obamacare or whatever is the new healthcare bill being debated about before you can say anything. I don't know. There's got to be some happy medium.
So here's a suggestion at a happy medium. When you watch a video like this, and you finish the video, you should say to yourself, I notice that I am confused. This is really strange. So therefore, it is very plausible that I don't understand it. So there's plenty of videos that I see on the internet where it doesn't look that confusing. Like, I'm not saying never comment on anything you see, but I'm saying when you see something that's really weird, that's really confusing, you should not have a strong opinion on it until you try to resolve that confusion. So at this point, I have a pretty strong opinion about what's happening in Harman's paper because I went from confused to reading the paper and trying to figure it out. That took a lot of work. So not saying everyone has to do that. Not everyone has to read the paper, but you should pay attention to if you're confused. If you're confused, it's plausible that you're missing something. And if you're missing something, you shouldn't be spouting off on Facebook about it.
Here's the problem, though. And I don't think this is much a problem for our audience who've already gone through the course and heard us talk about open-mindedness and confirmation bias and stuff. But the comments that because today I finally started reading all the Facebook comments on this stuff under like some of the popular pro-life pages and stuff. I don't think those people felt like they were confused after they watched the video. I'm reading comments from people, from armchair philosophers, who have watched the video like, this lady's an idiot. If only she understood what I, this smart pro-lifer, have to say. And typing with like 100% confidence and 0% humility.
They need intellectual virtue. So if you have intellectual virtue, maybe you'll notice that you're confused. And if you notice that you're confused, you should hold off on saying stuff. If you don't have any intellectual virtue, then we have a problem.
So I also think that there's the situation where not all of the pieces of this puzzle make sense. So you're watching a Princeton professor in a video seem outrageously ridiculous. I'm not saying that because she has qualifications, because she's a Princeton professor, that she necessarily knows what she's talking about, that she necessarily like by that virtue. However, it almost seems like we should second guess it. Like we shouldn't just immediately say she's being super circular. Right. I'm an armchair philosopher and I'm going to take down this, person, because that doesn't really make sense. If it was just a random person on Facebook Live ranting, I would have it's a little more understandable to comment on their live feed. What are you talking about?
That's a great point. So like think of like this analogy. If you're on campus and you see the exact same argument, except it's not coming out of a Princeton professor. It's like some dude on campus and he's smoking a joint while he's talking to you. Then it's understandable to be like, this seems really weird and you don't seem very credible and none of this is making sense. And it's okay to not be like, all right, I'm willing to devote an hour of my life to really making sure that I understand you. Right. When it's a Princeton philosophy professor, a little bit more, there's more credibility there. And it's a lot more likely that you're actually just misunderstanding, not that she's just dumb.
Don't assume between you and Liz Harman, there's only one person here who knows what a circular argument is.
Yeah.
Come on.
Do you know how much work goes into a PhD in philosophy?
I don't.
It is ridiculous. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of publishing papers, a lot of trying to make ideas clear and understand really complicated ideas. There is so much that Liz Harman understands that I don't begin to understand with the kind of training that she has. Like, I think my views on abortion are much better than hers and make much more sense than hers. Right. But it is indefensible to just write her off as she just must be a complete idiot, just spouting incoherent nonsense. Right. Just given the kind of training and background that she has. And again, and her argument is wrong.
I'm feeling a little bit self-conscious because I just told the true story of what happened with me when I watched this video. I didn't understand it the first time I read the stinking paper. I didn't understand it from the video. I read the actual paper, did not get it then. I talked to Tim. I was like, I'm having this really frustrating experience reading this paper where I feel like she keeps on getting ready to say what I'm wanting her to say, which is, it sounds like I'm saying X, which is circular, but instead I'm saying Y. And it happens over and over and over and over in this paper. And every time I read it, what I'm getting is, it sounds like I'm saying X, but what I'm actually saying is X. And I'm just like, wait, what's the different thing happening here? And I'm feeling like an idiot reading this paper because like, this is not tracking, it's not computing for me. So I've watched the video twice, I've read the paper once, I'm still like, where's the good argument here? And it took me having to read 2 other conservative philosophy guys' papers who were trying to explain what he's trying to say, and then me reading the paper a second time before I even started to get it. And in fact, I'd written all these margins in the paper because I was doing it on my iPad. So I've got like this, like, you know, Adobe Acrobat, like you can like type in things, you can like, you know, draw lines and highlight things. And so I had typed all these little things in margins, and I deleted like almost all of them on my second read through because like, nope, straw man, like all these different things I typed, like the made sense the first time. And I was reading the paper. Okay. So like there is like a lot of, I'm humbled by the paper because, and I think it's really helpful to remind ourselves of what Tim said in the beginning. She was not being very clear. I've read a lot of philosophy papers that I tracked with a lot better than this one. I feel like it shouldn't have taken as much work to understand what Liz Harman is trying to say. I think she's trying to say something kind of interesting. Still wrong, but kind of interesting. But I had to work really, 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 really hard to get at it. And so, yeah, there's some kind of like I'm glad you said we should give some slack to people who misunderstood it. She's being really unclear. But I'm also like in this emotional place of frustration of having read a whole bunch of really, really derogatory comments from people about her. We'll get to that later. But so I'm in this weird place of, there's some slack that should be given to some people, and then I think some people acted really badly.
Yes. That's
so let's
true.
transition to the first clip, which I selected. And when I was first watching the video, this was my first yellow flag where I was like, okay, most pro-life people might not understand this. So let's pull up that clip and give it a listen.
And I think if a fetus hasn't ever been conscious, it hasn't ever had any experiences, and we abort it at that stage, that actually nothing morally bad happens.
Okay, so she says this thing very briefly at the very beginning of the video, and then never mentions it again, which is, or maybe it was edited out. I don't know. But I kind of want to address what she means by that statement. So when we talk about personhood and we use the equal rights argument, where a lot of times we're talking about properties. So degree properties would be something like intelligence. So when we're talking about, look around everyone we can see right now, some people, Josh always says some people are super, super smart and some people are trying their best. And we always get laughs for that. So that's a degree property. When you look around at a group of people, they all have different variations of that thing, like intelligence, athletic ability, whatever. So you can have degree properties also be threshold, but a threshold is kind of like once this thing has crossed over this barrier, now it's like crossed over a threshold, like you're walking through a door and you're now in a different group. So it's not necessarily, can you think better than this person? It's, can you think at all? Once you cross over that threshold, you can think at all. You can breathe at all. Something like that is a threshold, and that's very different. So a lot of pro-choice philosophers have different thresholds where they assign personhood to a embryo or fetus. Once you can think at all, once you are self-aware at all, now you are a person.
Real quick.
Okay.
So I want to do something for people who want to do a deep dive on this. If you have grabbed the paper and if you want to follow along with us, we're going to try to help you follow along. So you don't have to, and I'm not expecting everyone who listens to this podcast is going to do this deep dive with us, but I am linking to the paper. And if you want to I'm going to kind of jump in and kind of track with these guys. So we're on and this is tricky because this is from a journal article. So at the top, the page numbers are all like in the 300s, but this is on page 316. If you want to track with us, this is the point where Harman really defines what her threshold is. It's towards the bottom of the page where she says, as it turns out, the fetus was not the beginning of their child. Its entire existence lacked any moment of consciousness or experience. It turns out that the fetus did not have any moral status. This is the point that Rachel is referring to in the paper.
So in her paper, Harman says she's talking about an early fetus. And what by early fetus, she means a fetus before it has any intrinsic properties that themselves confer moral status on the fetus. So this is like before the fetus has crossed any significant threshold that gives it serious moral consideration or full personhood.
Real quick, let's talk about the way this is using the term intrinsic properties. This was really confusing for me, especially the first time I read the paper, and Tim was able to kind of help me out because the way that I read intrinsic properties as a pro-lifer who's coming from kind of a J.P. Moreland philosophical worldviews place, I think is very different than the way that Harman is using the phrase intrinsic properties. The way I think of intrinsic properties, or the way I've been like trained to think about intrinsic properties, is these are properties that you have in virtue of the kind of thing you are. So you either have it or you don't.
And you can't not have them.
Right. Or else it would be a different kind of a property, but it would be like an accidental property or something like that. That's not how C's using this phrase at all, though, right?
Yeah. Her saying the definition of an early fetus is a fetus before it has any intrinsic properties that themselves confer moral status on the fetus is just like nonsense language as a definition if you're thinking of intrinsic properties that way.
Right.
Which is definitely confusing. So I think the way to understand what she means is when she says intrinsic properties, she means value-giving properties. Mm-hmm. So whatever properties you have to have in order to facilitate consciousness. The brain development being whatever it is and everything else, those culminate in the value-giving properties of being able to be conscious, being able to have experiences. And I think just remove intrinsic from the discussion because we use it very differently. And I think probably that it's a mistake on her part, but I'm not sure to what extent it's a mistake on her part and to what extent it's a different communities talk about things in different ways. And so I don't want to come down hard on her. But in terms of that, yeah, she's not talking intrinsic. It's a property that we don't have at some point in our existence, but at some point we do get.
So read the paper, ingest in your head, substitute value-giving properties whenever she says intrinsic properties, and it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. So given that as the background for what her threshold view is, she's once it can be conscious, then it's a person. It has full moral status. Prior to that, it's an early fetus that doesn't have at least the same kind of moral status. She has a very unusual approach beyond that. So most pro-choice philosophers are going to say before that, it doesn't really have moral consideration. Her approach is different because she believes in what she calls the actual future principle. And this is really, really important. So we're gonna talk about this and explain what it is. And it's very, very easily misunderstood and was very misunderstood by many people. So let's go ahead and play the clip of her introducing this.
Okay.
Among early fetuses, there are two very different kinds of beings. So, James, when you were an early fetus, and Elliot, when you were an early fetus, all of us, I think that we already did have moral status then. But we had moral status in virtue of our futures, in virtue of the fact that we were the beginning stages of persons. But some early fetuses will die early in pregnancy, either due to abortion or miscarriage. And in my view, that's a very different kind of entity. That's something that doesn't have a future as a person, and it doesn't have moral status.
So the way that sounds...
It sounds like you're saying.
It sounds like she's saying, conveniently, it's just okay to kill people because then...
They didn't have an actual future.
They didn't have a future beyond the point that you killed them. So it's like, so killing is a self-justifying act or something like that. And that's not at all what she's saying. So what she's saying is definitely peculiar, but it's different than that. What she's saying is whether or not you at some point in the future become a person changes the equation on whether or not you had moral status in the past. So two side-by-side fetuses. Fetus A is going to survive to adulthood. Fetus B is going to die as a early fetus, quote unquote, before becoming a person. They might look the same. They've got the same development. Everything's the same, except the fact that one of them is going to survive means that that fetus at that time has moral status. And the other one, even though everything else is the same about them, it doesn't have moral status. This is the kind of thing that we can kind of know in retrospect. So it's very, very important to understand she's not trying to justify abortion here.
Yeah.
This is not how she's justifying her view that fetuses are not persons earlier than that. That's a different argument. She thinks that they're not conscious. Because they're not conscious, they're not persons.
Yeah.
This whole argument about the actual future principle is sending pro-lifers into kind of a tailspin tizzy or something, because they think that she's trying to use this to justify killing them.
Yeah.
And justifying killing someone on the grounds of, well, they don't have a future anymore is really, really weird. She's not arguing to pro-lifers in this paper. She's arguing to other pro-choice people. What she's trying to do, this is like the big picture way to understand what she's trying to do with her argument. She's just arguing to pro-choice people on whether we should have what she calls a very liberal view or a less liberal view. Very liberal view meaning early fetuses that die in abortions have no moral status whatsoever. It's a complete non-moral issue.
Yeah.
That's her view. And so she's arguing for that view on the grounds of 5 weird intuitions that seem to not fit the very liberal view. And we'll get to those in a little bit.
Right.
And so you shouldn't think of this actual future principle as just coming out of nowhere and be like, I'm just going to adopt this convenient ad hoc nonsense into my view and just call it good and pretend that I'm doing philosophy. Like, that's not what she's doing. That's not what she's doing. If you read her paper, the structure of the argument is she sees these 5 things that we'll get into as being kind of weird. If you assuming from the get-go, the pro-choice position is correct. Abortion is fine, it's justifiable, but there's 5 things that are kind of weird. So what is the best pro-choice way to understand those 5 weird things?
I think it's even more intense than just like justifiable. Like, she's saying the liberal view, you need no moral justification.
Correct.
This is not something that needs to be seriously considered. This is not something that is like either wrong or right. It's just very nonchalant.
Yeah, so that's her view. That's not the view that's the starting point. The starting point is the pro-choice position is correct. Early fetuses aren't persons. Whether or not you should have the view that it's a complete non-morally significant issue is the view that she's arguing for. That's not the point. That's the starting point. The starting point is the pro-choice position is correct, and the question is, how pro-choice should we be? How liberal should our view about abortion be? And so given that, she says, here are these 5 weird things, these weird intuitions that we have. Right. How can we best understand these 5 weird intuitions? And Harman says, well, assuming that the pro-choice position is correct, and given these 5 intuitions, it seems like if we kind of bring in out of nowhere this actual future principle, and that's going to help explain these intuitions.
Right.
So she's not arguing for the actual future principle in a traditional sense, and the way it comes out in the video is really, really weird. She is kind of arguing for it. It's kind of ad hoc, at least in a particular way, but not in the way that it sounds. What she's saying is, if we adopt this view, we just take it out of nowhere, there's no external evidence for it, but if we just put it in our view, then these 5 intuitions make more sense.
Yeah.
And so that means that my view that has this principle, the actual future principle, makes better sense of these 5 intuitions than the other pro-choice views. Therefore, other pro-choice people should become like me. That's the structure of what she's doing.
This is really, really important. So just real quick, I was going to list the 5 principles, the 5 intuitions that she's kind of working from. Let's not respond to them right now.
Sure.
Because I want to make a comment that might help people with the actual future principle. But just so people are kind of tracking with what she's doing, especially if you haven't read the paper, you should just pause now and read the paper and then come back. But anyway.
Most people aren't going to do that.
I know. Okay. But if you are with the paper, then at the top where it says 322, this is towards the very end of the paper. This is going to move into page 323. I'm just going to read this paragraph where she's saying what those 5 intuitions that she's trying to make sense of are. She says, claims 6 through 9 together with claim 13 establish conclusion 2. It is seen that the very liberal view is incompatible with the following attractive views. These are the intuitions. That some early fetuses are the appropriate objects of caring attitudes. That some early fetuses are the kinds of things we are prohibited from harming. That it is understandable to be upset by an early miscarriage. That the position of a woman genuinely unsure whether she will abort her pregnancy is unique, and that it is reasonable to regret an abortion when one does not regret the choice to abort. So these are these 5 intuitions. He's like, I think that these are understandable intuitions, so how do I kind of make sense of the pro-choice position? And that's what the actual future principle for her does.
Yes.
Tim said something to me when he was trying to explain the actual future principle to me that was really helpful, or I might have extended it into like thinking about it in a little bit of a different way. So I don't remember exactly what you, I don't want to strawman you. Here's the way I'm thinking of it in my head is for Harman, every single embryo falls into one of 2 buckets. Like I'm literally imagining huge buckets where all the embryos go. One bucket is they are going to live through pregnancy. They have a future past, and she never really says when her threshold is, let's say 20 weeks. There are all the embryos that will live, and there are all the embryos that will not. They are the embryos that have an actual future. These are the embryos that are not. And what's really important in a response to most of the straw men that I see on Facebook is this. She doesn't think that the embryos go from one bucket to the other one. She doesn't think there is ever a case where an embryo goes from bucket 1 has a future to bucket 2 has no future. In fact, she calls that metaphysically absurd somewhere in this paper. She's like really clear. There's not this thing where like day 1, it's got a future. Day 2, it's got no future. Day 3, it's got a future. Yeah. Day 4, it's got no future. So like, no, it never happens. They either do or they don't. And it's ontologically true whether or not they do or they don't from fertilization. They don't cross from one to the other, but they are in one camp or the other camp. And if they're in one camp, they have some moral status even before they have personhood. And if they're in the other camp, they have no moral status, because if they do have some moral status, then these intuitions don't make that much sense.
Yeah. So my view about her argument in general is that it's basically unsuccessful for the most part, not because the actual future principle is itself absurd. It's really goofy. It's a odd thing to bring into your view, but the problem with it is not that it's odd. It's that it's not necessary to do the kind of explaining that she thinks it is. Mm-hmm. So like 4 out of her 5 intuitions are explained just as well by other pro-choice views, and in at least a lot of cases far better by pro-life views. And so the fact that this is from the starting point, you have to assume that the pro-choice view is correct, is an issue in terms of the analysis. She's ruling out better explanations, and in some cases pro-life explanations. So 4 out of 5, one of them's a little bit different. We'll get to that. Her argument is unsuccessful not because the actual future principle is weird, but because it's unnecessary. You don't have to bring it in from the ether and drop it into your view to make sense of the rest of the world. You can do that other ways, and in ways that are much more intuitively justifiable. So let's talk about her 5 intuitions. So the first intuition that she has, that she thinks is a good reason to bring in this actual future principle, is on page 314 of the article. She says, the very liberal view is compatible with the view that some early fetuses are the appropriate objects of caring attitudes such as love. So she thinks it's this kind of weird thing that, on the one hand, we think that fetuses are non-persons, or early fetuses are non-persons, and that means it's okay to kill them. But on the other hand, it kind of seems like there's something good and appropriate about the fact that parents who are intending to have their children, they form strong bonds early in pregnancy. It's not just after like they start kicking or something. Right. It's like early in pregnancy, they feel really connected. And she's saying that she thinks that is a reason to adopt her view. So she wants to bring in the actual future principle, because what she thinks this is doing is explaining why fetuses that die ultimately in, for instance, abortions, it's okay to do that. It's okay to kill them. But at the same time, the fetuses that are what she calls the beginning of children, they have a future. It's appropriate and good and understandable that those parents come to love those children in that way, because they are at some point going to be children. One of the problems, at least like I think the first problem that comes to my mind about this, is the fact that she can't explain at all the kind of bond that parents have with children that die in miscarriages. So the same kind of bond that happens, there's an early bond that happens for a lot of parents with their children, with their early fetuses. And again, we can have a example A and example B side by side. Example A, that child grows into adulthood. Example B, dies in an early miscarriage, so before they ever become conscious. Mm-hmm. What Harman is going to have to say with her view is, yeah, it's really appropriate and good and makes a lot of sense in case A and doesn't make that much sense in case B.
To love the child.
To love the child. And this gets a little bit weird because later on she clarifies, we were talking about this earlier, like she's totally not results oriented.
Right.
Like she's actually like almost explicit about that. Like it's based on what they know at the time, whether or not it's reasonable at the time. And so this is weird to me that given that she's saying this is a great way to explain the fact that parents of children who survive form that early bond, given that she can't explain that early bond in earlier cases, in cases where the baby's died miscarriage.
And so, like, in my view, I don't think you need the actual future principle to make sense of why a lot of parents love early embryos. I think you could say embryos or early fetuses aren't persons, and people love them because they anthropomorphize them. I've got, a 4-year-old who totally anthropomorphizes all these stuffed animals that he has in his room, and he like has all this love for them, and it seems appropriate that he loves them. They're not persons, though. They're not, they're not the kind of thing that he thinks they are. But it's like, you don't see that many pro-choice people being, the obnoxious person coming and being like, shh, you're loving something before it's a thing, before it matters, man. It doesn't matter yet. It'll matter when it becomes conscious. So right at like about week 20, you should start carrying it like that. Like no one does that. But I think that's where a lot of pro-choice people are. What their view actually kind of entails is, yeah, you love something before it's actually this valuable thing. It becomes valuable later, assuming you want the kid and everything. And it just makes sense. People anthropomorphize animals all the time, and like that's fine.
Yeah, so I think that seems like a pretty fine response. I think I've never been inclined as a pro-life advocate to argue that fetuses are persons because parents form bonds with them before they have conscious experience. Like I don't think that would be an interesting argument.
Right.
And so given that, I think that as a pro-choice person responding to Harman, I think that argument would basically work. Like humans are wired to anthropomorphize. Like dolphins are not smiling at you; their faces just really look like they are, and like we're interpreting it that way, and like we do that all the time. And I think my view, like even as a pro-life person, is that it's not that offensive to say, yeah, they're not actually objects of affection. Which, of course, that's not my view because I'm pro-life and I think they're persons. Right. I think Harman, for some reason, is really unsatisfied with that. She thinks that like it's like disrespectful to those parents to say that their child isn't an appropriate object of affection.
So it might be that my interpretation of Harman's paper is different, and this is a place where you can correct me. So now I'm going to counter my own argument with my read of Harman, because I think if Harman were sitting here, and if I were writing the role play, be trying to be as accurate of what Harman would say if she were in the room, which that would be really cool if we just get Harman in the room. I think she would say that a couple who anthropomorphizes and thus loves their early embryo is doing something inaccurate. Like it is like understandable at an epistemological level, but it's not like ontologically based in reality. And what I want to do is try to explain that like here's how you should actually feel. You shouldn't actually love something because you're anthropomorphizing it. You should love something because it has moral status. And so because I'm basically agreeing it makes sense to love these embryos that are going to become persons, I need the actual future principle. So in Harman's view, it actually makes sense at an ontological level to love early embryos, whereas other pro-choice people are going to have to say it like epistemologically makes sense, but it doesn't actually makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good representation of Harman, and I just don't find it to be that strong or interesting. Like Harman still has to say parents who form bonds with their embryos that are going to be miscarried, they have bonds towards something that's not an appropriate object of affection, and that's still weird, and she's got to do something with that. Her view like allows her to get around the problem of one of those buckets that you referred to, but not the other. And so if that makes her feel that much better, good for her. But I don't think it's that interesting.
It's like she's saying that doesn't she say in the paper that like when the parents go through the miscarriage, it turns out that they weren't loving the child as if they were loving what they're losing is like this potential future or something like that.
Something like that.
And that seems weird to say because like I've having experienced miscarriage, I don't feel like my feelings of love I had for our first kid were that different from the feelings of love that I had for the other kids, and it feels like a very retroactive thing to say no, but actually you felt a different kind of love for the first. If anything, we have more. I may have had more love for my first kid in the first pregnancy than I did any of the others because all the other pregnancies are super freaked out that we're going to miscarry again.
Sure, there's more joy to it. Or something.
All the joy of our future pregnancies got kind of stolen from me in that first miscarriage, and that's sad, but it's true. So if anything, I was more guarded about how I should feel emotionally. I had tons of love for the first kid, like during the pregnancy, because I wasn't trying to hold anything back or guard myself or anything. And I think I agree. Her attempt at what to do with someone like me who's gone through, I don't think works very well.
Yeah, so I think she would say you're not a goofy person for forming the same bonds, like epistemologically. I think that's helpful. And it happens to be the case that ontologically, in the one case, it's an appropriate object, and in the other case, it's not an appropriate object. I think that's sketchy at best, and it doesn't explain anything interesting. Like, this isn't lending weight to bringing in this super weird principle for your view.
Tracking. Anything that you want to add before we move on to number 2? Because already Tim is showing that he was right, that we apparently can't do these 5 intuitions in 3 or 4 sentences.
That's why I'm not interrupting. I want to move on.
Fair enough.
Awesome.
Intuition 2. Let's try to lightning round this thing.
So I think I want to actually skip 2 and do 2 last, because 2 is the oddball of the 5 that I think actually she has an interesting point there.
Fair enough.
So her statement for the third intuition that she's working with starts at the bottom of page 315. She says, the very liberal view is compatible with a reasonable view about miscarriages of early fetuses. A couple may be understandably upset about such a miscarriage, but it is inappropriate to mourn the death of the fetus. So I think the hard thing here is this is very similar to the first one. And so it's kind of like a lot of what we have just said about the first one kind of, I think, applies here. Part of the issue is I don't think she's accomplishing something that's that helpful. I don't think anyone thinks that it's really hard to justify the idea that a couple may be understandably upset about a miscarriage.
Yeah.
That's not a difficult intuition to defend. The other side of it, that like the end of that sentence is, but it's inappropriate to mourn the death of the fetus. So my best attempt at understanding this, like my honestly most charitable understanding of why she's even using this as support, is she thinks it's just friggin' obvious that it's dumb to mourn fetuses that die in miscarriages. Mm-hmm. And I don't know where she's getting that. That's not obvious at all to me.
I wonder if that's a cultural thing among a lot of other the people who have the more extreme liberal view on abortion. I wonder if this is a thing that's talked about a lot of times, and they're kind of talking about like how crazy pro-lifers are and things like that. Like if only they understood that we're right about abortion, they wouldn't be so sad about miscarriages. It wouldn't be as big of a deal because people lose potential, possible cool future things all the time, and it's not as big of a deal as like they're thinking that they're mourning a death here. It's not a death of anything important. It's more like they should just feel like a little bit sad. Oh, this one didn't work out. We should try pregnancy, again soon.
But it's weird that she feels as strongly about that as she seems to, given the first one. Given like she wants to grant that a early embryo in the case of one that's going to survive is an appropriate object of affection. But it seems also like the most charitable read of her, she's not that clear about this, is that it's fine. It's not epistemologically weird or indefensible on the part of the parent. But the end of the sentence on 3 is, but it's inappropriate to mourn the death of the fetus. And so I think the best way the most charitable way to understand her, this is not being that clear, is that what she means is it's not like stupid of the parent Like it's understandable the parent to have a bond or something,
Right.
but they're ontologically not an object of affection,
Correct.
and they're not an appropriate object of mourning.
Correct. As he spells that out at the bottom of that page.
Okay, so I think that's not that interesting a thing to say. I think she's speaking to her culture, and that's fine. So if you're pro-choice and you like, it just really frustrates you that pro-life people will mourn their fetuses, and you're trying to figure out how to explain that, then this would be a reason to consider the actual future principle, I guess. I don't think there's that much there, personally.
Number 3.
That was
Or
number 3.
number 4. Sorry, we're going out of order. Right.
We're just skipping 2. We'll get back to it.
Right.
So the fourth one is, this is on page 317, the very liberal view is compatible with an explanation of the unique position of a woman genuinely unsure whether she will abort her pregnancy. And so what she thinks that the actual future principle is doing here is it's helping to make sense of this unique position of a woman who is undecided on whether or not to abort. And that the fact that the moral status of the embryo is dependent on her decision, because her decision is going to result in whether or not it has an actual future or not, helps this in some way. And I don't think it does. And I don't think it's a hard thing to explain for any other pro-choice view. Why a woman would be unsure whether she's going to abort her pregnancy, there's a lot of natural other ways to explain that. So if I'm a pro-choice person that doesn't want to use the actual future principle, I'd say, well, she's anthropomorphized the fetus or something, or she's got this maternal instinct, and there's an evolutionary reason why she has a maternal instinct. And so because of that, choosing to abort, which she totally has a moral right to do, is going against an instinct. Or it might be
pro-lifers have stigmatized abortion wrongly.
Pro-lifers have stigmatized abortion. Or she might be thinking she'd really like to have a child. Like her sibling has a child, and like she loves that child. And so maybe I do want to go through this pregnancy and be a parent of an actually born child one day. And that would be a reason for her to be undecided. The actual future principle isn't doing anything interesting here.
So here's what's going on here. Tim is feeling self-conscious because he's talking a lot and Rachel and I aren't responding. And it's not because Rachel and I have nothing to say. It's because we had a whole debate before we started recording whether we should talk about these 5 intuitions. And I pushed really hard for us to talk about these 5 intuitions. And Tim was like, it's going to take 30 minutes. And I was like, I think it'll take 5. And it's already taken 5.
Way over 5.
So
planning fallacy, my friend.
my view is it's helpful for us to talk about the intuitions to help people understand where Harman is coming from. And I was wrong, and it takes more than 5 minutes to do that. And so Rachel and I, because we don't want the entire podcast to be about the 5 intuitions, we're just kind of choosing not to add much because we want to basically do as minimal of a job as necessary for us to kind of get people thinking about the intuitions and where Harman's coming from without adding a whole lot of length to the podcast. So you're doing great, Tim. Stop feeling self-conscious. You're doing exactly what I wanted you to do. And yes, you were closer to being right than I was, although I still hope it didn't take 30 minutes to do these 5 intuitions.
We'll see. The fifth intuition that she thinks lends support to bringing in the actual future principle is on page 321. She says, the liberal view on abortion is compatible with the rationality of 2 common experiences of women who have abortions. Finding having an abortion very difficult, though the choice to abort is settled, and regretting an abortion, though one does not regret the choice to abort. And I think once again here, it's kind of same territory. This isn't that difficult to explain by other pro-choice views. Mm-hmm. And I would also say that it's better explained by pro-life views, but because there's like actual guilt because there's actually something wrong going on there. But even forgetting that, because she's just assuming that that's not the case, I think any other pro-choice person could just say people have genuinely different futures they're considering. They might want to have the child, or they might feel guilty. Maybe they come from a religious home and they've always been told that abortion is murder. And so this is causing them to feel like this abortion is really difficult. They've got all this false guilt going on. But it's not actually guilt. Again, I'm not speaking as actual Tim. Right. Speaking as a pro-choice person who doesn't think the actual future principle is necessary. And the same thing would be true of regret. It's the same, caused by the same reasons. It's all this false guilt stuff. You don't need an actual future principle to explain these things.
Right. Whereas obviously from the pro-life view, we want to say people have consciences and a lot of times are kind of in touch with the idea that like maybe they just did something wrong. And it's not just that pro-lifers have been stigmatizing it. It's like this is part of how we work. This is how we're designed to work, is to know that sometimes we're doing something wrong and then to feel some kind of an appropriate sense of regret or guilt afterwards.
Yeah.
No, let's talk about the interesting one now. This is
All right.
going to get exciting.
So is it going to get exciting because you disagree with my view?
No.
Okay. That's disappointing. Second of her 5, and the one that I think is the most interesting, is on page 315. Mm-hmm. She says, it is possible to give a good account of how the very liberal view is compatible with prohibitions on harming early fetuses that will become persons. So this is interesting because she doesn't bring up the specific case of thalidomide. She brings up fetal alcohol syndrome, and she brings up smoking at another point. But like, if you think in terms of the thalidomide objection to the sovereign's own view, that's what she's concerned about here, but in a personhood context. And this has been really trippy for me reading this paper and trying to make sense of what's going on here, because I've never thought of something like thalidomide as being a good argument against personhood views. I've thought of that clearly as this is a refutation of the statement, a woman can do anything she wants with anything inside her body.
Right.
And so it's this weird experience as Harman saying, this is kind of a problem for pro-choice people. Like typical pro-choice people, not me, not Harman, who don't have the actual feature principle, they're going to have a really hard time explaining why it's wrong to use thalidomide or to cause fetal alcohol syndrome or something for a at the time non-person fetus, but who will eventually be born. And this one, I think actually she's right. And we're still kind of wrestling. We're still processing this kind of as a team. But at least there's a much more interesting point going on here, and a lot of it comes down to the kind of power that comes from Don Marquis's argument. So let's talk Don Marquis. And Josh, if you could introduce that, and then I'll circle back and explain why I think that's so effective here.
Yeah, so I started looking into Don Marquis's future like ours argument probably, 6-7 years ago when Trent Horn first started talking to me about it. Trent was super excited about this future like ours argument. He was talking to me about it. We went to dinner one time together, and I'm not trying to name... What's the word?
Name drop or something?
I'm not trying to name drop Trent Horn. Saying he told me about it. I was like, I've never heard about this before, but Trent Horn has always read all the things, and so he was telling me about this thing, and I was like, "This is really interesting." So we ended up. I read through the paper a couple of times, and we were actually planning for a while on doing a Life Report episode about it. I actually had Don Marquis, he had agreed to come and do an interview about this, and the only reason we didn't record it was because I wanted to do it a certain way. Maybe one day we'll do it here, but the idea was I want to not just talk about this argument, but I also want to talk about there's a lot of philosophers who have written kind of responses to Marquis, and Marquis has written now a bunch of responses to those guys. I want to get into all that stuff, and then became this huge project and then we started Equal Rights Institute, and I stopped doing Life Report.
The perfect became the enemy of the good there, Josh.
It really did. But having read that paper, I started using it on campus sometimes with people, especially if I use the equal rights argument, and then they wouldn't really have a counter, or maybe we'd be done going through the counters. I'd go all Jew shooting on them, and we at some point they'd run out of steam, but they didn't walk away. They were just kind of just be staring at our signs or our exhibit or whatever, and just standing there and all right. So now there's this awkward pause, or maybe thinking pause, or maybe he's just staying around. So sometimes I'd be like, let me throw out this other idea at you. See how this works, and be all right. And be there's this really interesting atheist pro-life philosopher named Don Marquis. I always say he's an atheist. It's because I really want them to understand this is not a inherently religious argument. This is from an atheist, man. It's a really interesting philosopher named Don Marquis who's trying to answer the question of why is it wrong to kill people. Obvious, we're all agreeing it's wrong to kill people. If you imagine a 4-year-old girl who's murdered, who's just shot dead, everyone agrees it's wrong. Why exactly? He wants to know precisely why is it wrong for her to be killed. And some people say, well, it's wrong because it makes her parents and her family and friends really sad. And he's yeah, that's part of it. Doesn't seem like it's all of it though. And then he says, some people will be well, it makes the murderer a worse person. It damages his psyche or his soul or something like that. He's yeah, maybe. But it seems there's a lot more to it. It seems there's something wrong that's been done to the girl, but that seems a little bit intuitively weird for the atheist who thinks she's instantly non-existent now. There's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no continued existence for her.
She doesn't know the difference.
Sees nothing now. It's gone. There's nothing going on for her now. So how could it be wrong? So he said, I think something's wrong been done to her. And from an atheist perspective, my explanation is that something has been stolen from her. She's been robbed of the thousands and thousands of experiences that she would have had if she had not been killed, that she either would value now or even would value later. All the experiences that like typically human beings enjoy, like eating great food and falling in love and having sex and all those different things. She would value those valuable experiences later. And maybe the worst thing that you can do to someone in an atheist perspective, maybe even worse than torturing someone, is to steal from them the thousands upon thousands of valuable experiences that they would have had, that they would have valued. And he says, and if that's true, that seems like that makes a lot of sense of why it's wrong to kill 5-year-old girls in an atheist worldview. That seems like that argument would work just as well for a 5-day embryo, assuming that this is an unborn child that is going to survive. So he says this doesn't work for like anencephalic children who are going to die like really quickly after birth or maybe before birth. Like those things don't have valuable futures. And this wouldn't work as an end of life issues, kind of like this wouldn't like argue against euthanasia. And for him, both of those things are not negatives about his argument. He feels like there's a positives because he doesn't have a problem with abortion for anencephalic children, and he does not have a problem with euthanasia. So where a bunch of our listeners are like, I don't want to use this argument because it doesn't explain those two things. He's like, yeah, it doesn't explain those two things. I don't want it to. That makes my argument stronger. I don't have to like bite this weird anencephalic bullet that you other pro-lifers have to bite, and you have to bite the euthanasia bullet. Like, you've got
atheists, we're the ones biting bullets in their view.
Exactly.
Makes their view stronger.
So he's like, this view makes all kinds of sense of everything, but it also makes us like, it says most abortions are very, very wrong because you're depriving a child of the valuable future that it would have had after birth, after it grows up, etc.
Even if you want to make an argument that it's not a person right now, it still has a future.
Right.
It's just kind of a sidestep personhood argument kind of a thing there.
Yeah.
And it's very important to say, because of the kind of thing it is, it has this future. Like if normal things progress and we don't like intercede in some way, it's going to have these future experiences, just like you and I.
Right.
Yeah.
He's not going to say that skin cells have a valuable future just because technically you could take skin cells and extract the DNA and put them in, like you can do this whole like cloning process. He's going to say, no. But assuming it's an organism that has this intrinsic potential to have this valuable future, then it's wrong to kill it, assuming it has that valuable future.
Yeah.
And I've found this to work pretty well. Like we haven't talked a lot about it publicly at ERI because like none of us feel like we've tested it enough to make strong statements about like how persuasive, like we make very strong statements about the equal rights argument. Why? Because we have so many experiences using it, and we know a lot of other people who have so many experiences using it all over the place. And there's kind of this consistent success rate thing going on. And at some point, we might talk more about this argument. We haven't done a ton of testing, but I've done some. And so far, I have found it to be real. It makes pro-choice people really stop and think a lot. But to be fair, still, I haven't had enough experiences to make really strong statements.
Yeah, I've kind of gone back and forth on the value of this argument. I remember a few years ago being like, this is weird, and it's not helpful. And there are some kind of definitely some understandable objections to it that maybe we should talk about sometime. But as a practical tool, I've definitely had very, very positive experiences where like I think basically the future value argument is like a wonderful screwdriver for specific people, and particularly atheists. Atheists in particular are going to be more likely that this is going to be a really helpful screwdriver for them. But my experience trying to use it is often it's like, what? Like this, like that's totally does nothing. And so I think that makes it a good one to try and have in your toolbox. But it's not like consistent and reliable, at least in my experience so far. The last outreach that we did at Winthrop University, Rachel came out for, like this is one of the things that's like, okay, I'm coming to my laboratory. This is one of the things I want to test, and just didn't get anything useful there. Like I was able to use it like once, and it was not helpful for that particular person. It's harder to bring up, which makes it harder to test. But there's a lot of like interesting intuitive power to the idea. Yeah. Harming someone's future in that way, there's a problem there. And it seems like that is at least part of what's going on that's wrong about killing. You are depriving someone of something. Right. And so I think I've for a long time been very inclined to use Don Marquis type language when I talk about like the thalidomide objection. I'll say, why is it not wrong to deprive someone of their future entirely, but it is wrong to hurt their future? Mm-hmm. That's a really weird thing to try to explain. And this has been very, very effective for me. And so thinking in those terms, when I read this Harman point, I think she's actually onto something. I think the issue of why is it wrong to hurt someone's future, but it's not wrong to deprive them of their future entirely, is a valid question, not just for people making a bodily rights argument, but also for people making a person argument. Because there's still, it's like Don Marquis sidesteps the person in question. This is still an issue for people making the person a point. And I just haven't really done that before. So it's something that I want to try. It might be that it's not pragmatically effective, but I think it is a legitimately major problem. And so if you agree with me and you're a pro-choice person and you think it's a major problem, I think this is Harman's best argument for why you should take this ad hoc actual future principle and shove it into your view with no other justification, because it does make more natural sense of why it's wrong to use thalidomide on a baby that you're not then going to kill. Other than that, she doesn't really have any actual defense of what she's doing, because the other intuitions aren't doing that much for her view. Yeah. So again, like we're not like, we don't think this is a great argument. There's a lot of problems with it, but it's different than that. It's a circular argument. She's saying here are intuitions for why we should take this principle that I'm not defending in any other way and just shove it in our view and try to make our other intuitions make more sense.
Right.
So let's talk about the objections which are brought up against the actual future principle. The biggest one, I would say, is the one that's in the video. Mm-hmm. And James Franco asked Harman, pretty much he's calling out, is this a circular argument? And it seems like you are conveniently picking and choosing if abortion's wrong or if it's not wrong. So let's play that clip.
Okay.
So what you're saying is, if the fetus is never destined to become a person, it doesn't have moral status. If a woman decides to have an abortion with an early fetus, just that act or that intention negates the moral status of that early fetus. Just because if she goes out and has an abortion, she's pretty certain that it's not going to become a person.
Right. So it might look like, on my view, abortion is permissible because you had the abortion.
Yeah.
But that abortion wouldn't have been permissible if you didn't have the abortion.
Right.
Well, that's not quite That's not quite the view for, I think, two different reasons. Okay. So one reason is that you have moral status, and in my view, back when you were an early fetus, you had moral status. But it's not that aborting you would have been wrong, because if your mother had chosen to abort her pregnancy, then it wouldn't have been the case that you would have had moral status, because you would have died as an early fetus. So she would have been aborting something that didn't have moral status. So my view isn't that if you do abort, abortion is okay, but if you don't abort, abortion would have been wrong. But what it turns out is that it's a contingent matter that you have moral status. You actually have moral status, but you might not have counted morally at all. If you had been aborted, you would have existed, but you just would have had this really very short existence in which you wouldn't have mattered morally.
Oh my gosh. It's like Franco asks her a question about a thing that she actually, she specifically talks about this in her paper. She distinguishes her view from what she calls the mother's intention principle.
Right.
And she rejects it, and she clarifies, here's the difference between the two. But when Franco asks her about it, she doesn't go into any of the actual explanation between the difference there. She just rambles about the actual future principle again, which makes it sound like the same thing that Franco's concerned about from the get-go. It's so frustrating.
I think at first she tries to restate his concern to make him aware that she heard him, but then rambles and doesn't do a good job of explaining her response to the objection.
Yeah.
And so that's this is the moment in that video that solidifies the confusion and makes it seem super circular.
Yeah.
Like Josh was saying before, she says, I'm not saying X, I'm saying X.
That's what it sounds like.
Instead of Y.
But she's not doing that because on page 318 she addresses that.
Yep.
And so I think the simplest way to understand this, I think what you said earlier, Joshua, with the 2 buckets is really, really helpful actually. And that's very, very straightforward. You got 2 buckets. The mother's intention principle would say as the mother's intention changes, the fetus goes from one bucket to the other. It has moral status, doesn't have moral status. It has moral status, doesn't have moral status as she's changing her mind.
Right.
The Harman view, the actual future principle, the way that it's structured, they never change buckets. Either they have moral status or they don't have moral status. And she's really clear on why she doesn't hold the mother's intention principle. I've heard pro-choice people argue that exact thing, and not with the phrase the mother's intention principle, but that exact thing. And she says this is metaphysically absurd because that means that the fluctuations in the status don't correspond to any fluctuations in the fetus's nature. And that's a really good point. It's a similar kind of issue with like viability objections. We say it's not a person because it's not viable, but then like, oh well, now we have better technology in the room. Oh no, oh my, now it's a person. It'd be the same kind of problem. Its value is fluctuating based on something that has nothing to do with its actual nature. And then if she just said that, then it would have clarified the view and made it more understandable.
She should have said there's 2 buckets, and you never go from one bucket to the other bucket.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what she's trying to say is, we know now because you're here. This is evidence that you were in that bucket. Like you are in that bucket.
Right.
When you were a fetus, you were in that bucket. But she doesn't do that well. If you would have been aborted, we could deduce that you were in the other bucket. But like, it's hard to explain that, and she's without the buckets.
I was going to say there's a lot of switching between epistemology and ontology in the paper,
Yeah.
and she's not being really clear when she's going from one to the other, when she's trying to make a point about one but not the other.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this whole paper is just impossible to talk about in a 5-minute video with an actor. Like, you're just not going to do that successfully.
To be fair, the actor doesn't say much besides in that one clip. He kind of set up and like, he didn't even know how to start the conversation. He's like, let's talk about abortion. He's just kind of like waiting for her to like talk. Like, he didn't talk much. He got people to watch the video.
He did, and that's unfortunate for Harman because she's being understandably strawmanned.
Yeah, I feel bad for her.
So let's talk about like a special case where, like with Gianna, let's look at her case and see how Harman would respond to what bucket she belongs in. So Josh, do you want to?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't just immediately recognize from the first name, Gianna Jessen is a very famous pro-life speaker, a very effective pro-life speaker. She's one of several pro-life speakers who are abortion survivors. Not meaning she was born after 1973, but like literally her mom, kind of combined with a doctor, tried to abort her, and she survived. She survived in her case because it was a saline abortion, and basically she got really, really burned up, but she lived, where almost all babies die from that process. And then her mom went into delivery mode, and that, it was kind of too late, and then she was, out, and at that point they had to protect her. I know there's a few other abortion survivors, or at least one other one who does speaking. And so anyway, when I was watching the video the first time, kind of in my mind, this was kind of the main objection that I was thinking about, and I wasn't alone, because today as I was reading Facebook comment after Facebook comment after Facebook comment, I was seeing several people bring up Gianna Jessen specifically as well. What would Harman say if, a mom decides she's going to have an abortion, and they try to go through with the abortion, but ultimately the abortion is unsuccessful, and the baby survives and is born and is now a pro-life speaker? Like, what do you say? It seems like maybe her view doesn't make very good sense of that. But again, if you think of the buckets thing, Gianna was always in a certain bucket.
Yeah.
But everyone really thought wrongly, had like justified false beliefs about what bucket Gianna was actually in, and like that's like really tragic, basically.
Yeah, Harman, I believe, would say unsuccessful abortions are a great tragedy, because then you are harming someone who has an actual future. And so if you're going to start an abortion, in which case you're taking surgical instruments to somebody and dismembering them, you really ought to finish that and do that successfully. And when you do that successfully, then that will mean that that's a person who's in the second bucket. They don't have an actual future. They have no moral status.
Right.
No future before being conscious. But if you do that unsuccessfully, then it's kind of like you're like the thalidomide thing. You're harming an actual person, someone who has moral status now, because they do have an actual future where they will be conscious later.
Right.
So Gianna Jessen, terrible tragedy, but she would say it wouldn't have been a tragedy if they had successfully aborted her.
Right.
And so abortion doctors need to be good at what they do and actually abort and not just injure.
Harman would say it's not only not a tragedy, it has zero moral significance at all.
Yes.
So one thing that she's really clear about that makes me feel that she is being consistent is, like, if we would ask her go back to when Gianna's mom was, like, on her way to the abortion clinic, she'd firmly decided she was going to have an abortion. If you asked Harman, does the fetus in her womb at this moment have moral status? She would probably respond with something like, I'm confident that that fetus does not, because it's going to die.
Right.
It's going to be in that bucket. But then Gianna survives the abortion. She grows up. Harman would now say, I had a justified false belief about that fetus. Turns out, because of what actually happened, that fetus had moral status. It was in the bucket of moral status all along.
Yeah. Gianna Jessen always had an actual future. Nobody knew it or thought she did during the first, 4 or 5 months of her life.
And we had really good reason to believe that she didn't have a moral status, according to Harman.
Right.
She says on page 319, the pregnant woman may have smoked while knowing she was pregnant because she was planning to abort. Her choice to smoke was morally blameless, in that given the facts as she knew them, her action should not have harmed any other being with moral status. When she becomes unable to obtain an abortion, she will be upset by the fact that she has harmed a being with moral status, but she should not blame herself. And the exact same thing would apply to Gianna. You'd say she had good reason to believe that she wasn't harming a person with moral status. But now, after the fact, okay, now there's medical complications that come with that, and that's sad. But she's not blameworthy. She had good reason to believe that she wasn't harming someone.
So I want to talk about her fourth conclusion in her paper, which I was I was shook. I really was, because it's a very strong pro-abortion argument. I mean, not strong as indefensible, but something you don't see every day. It's a strong claim. So in short, she says something along the lines of, we're all thinking about this issue of early abortions the wrong way. The pro-choice community, the pro-life community, our public society as a whole, we think about abortion as being a very difficult decision, something that should be considered kind of extensively before proceeding with the abortion. But she says, I think everyone's wrong on that. We should be doing a serious moral consideration and deliberation before allowing an early pregnancy or early fetus to continue. So actually, the thing you should deliberate about is, should I continue with this pregnancy? Should I give birth? The thing that you should kind of not give so much consideration to is, should I have this abortion or not? Because that doesn't have a strong moral consequence. But being a bad parent and raising your child in a situation which they're going to be unloved, unwanted, uncared for, abused, that has a lot of moral things attached to it.
Because they're persons with actual futures.
They are, exactly. Where you're having an early abortion, there's nothing serious going on.
Yeah.
This statement made me reread the entire piece, because I felt as though she is thinking about early fetuses the same way a lot of people would think about ovum or sperm. And we kind of discussed this before recording the podcast, because this is something that affected the way I thought about a lot of her argument. So I want to get your guys' take if you are kind of in my camp too, because I think pro-life people, we see something as very significant happening with a zygote, right? Like this is that really significant threshold where before that zygote exists, but if it's just sperm and ovum, there's philosophically different things happening, different sort of decisions, right? So like the responsibility to abstain from sex, so the responsibility to use birth control or something like that, that, pro-life people would talk about, the responsibility of having sex is something that's serious and you should deliberate before doing. Where I think she's looking at the same way of the responsibility of continuing a pregnancy after it's begun, because her threshold for when that embryo matters is later. It's that consciousness.
Yeah, right. I think that's a helpful analogy. It seems really weird coming from a perspective of seeing valuable life beginning at conception, and there's a person at conception. But if you have a view like Harman's, like I'm fairly impressed with the fact that she wrote this. Like she's really consistent. She's really serious about her view. And I think if you're going to be a Harman-style pro-choice person, I don't think you have any other options than to accept conclusion 4. I think you're stuck with conclusion 4. And I think she's just honest enough to say it.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that, partially because I see it as one of the best reasons to just reject her whole argument. Like it leads to something that's so ridiculous and so absurd on its face. It's not like logically impossible, but like it is consistent. If you have her view, then there's absolutely no significance at all to abortion. And like basically everyone knows otherwise. Obviously there's some kind of significance to abortion. And to say that like people should really deliberate and like have good justification to not abort is a very, very extreme statement. And so if you're comfortable being that kind of an extremist, then maybe the Harman pro-choice approach is for you. I think most people can't do it. So I just appreciate her for being honest.
It's sort of the Peter Singer thing. I mean, it's ironic that it seems like there's a super impressive consistency among Princeton philosophy professors. Because there's something similar going on here. Like he's got a different personhood view that would say that newborns aren't persons, and he just bites the bullet. And it, like doesn't just admit that, says you should too. Like that is the more rational view, and we should try to be rational. There's something similar going here. She's saying it actually makes more sense for you to believe like I do, not a semi kind of liberal position on abortion, but a super liberal position on abortion. That actually makes more sense if my premises are true.
Yeah. So, I mean, good for her for spelling that out, because like if I had just read the rest of the paper and she'd left that conclusion off, I don't think I would have connected the dots. Like she's connecting the dots. This is the roughest implication of my view. And I don't think she feels that way, but that's kind of how I felt reading it. It's like, here's the worst of it and being very upfront about it. So good for her on the clarity.
It's pretty far out there to say that if every woman who gets pregnant doesn't consider having an abortion, then she's being like careless and irresponsible. That's like so extreme.
Crazy.
So it's crazy she put it in there. I don't know. I wouldn't even necessarily, like if I was going to write a response to this paper for our class, I wouldn't necessarily be like, this is a conclusion that you have to agree with if she's right. Like if you're going to sign on to her, this is a like natural consequence of the view. I wouldn't think to write that. So props.
Really interesting though.
All right. So this has gotten really philosophical. This has been easily the hardest podcast that we've ever recorded, and the hardest podcast that will for anyone to listen to, probably to like track with everything. So if you're still with us, that's awesome. I'm glad you're here. Before we go, I want to talk a little bit about the experience that I had this morning. After having read this paper twice, after having watched the video, I think 5 times, after having read a couple of other helpful papers on this, one by Matt Anderson and one by Sharif
Gurgis, I think.
I think so. Well, I'm going to link to all those papers.
Yeah, Sharif Gurgis.
After having read all of those, for the very first time, I went back to start trying to read what other pro-lifers had said about this, because I'd kind of purposefully sheltered myself from that because I didn't want anyone in my head while I was trying to read this paper. I just want to like try to understand it just myself, and talking a bit with Tim, and not have, their pro-lifers have made videos about it, and conservatives have made videos about it, and obviously there's a lot of comments. I didn't look at any of that. But I did this morning. And I had a really awful experience. And a much worse experience reading these comments than I would have if I'd read them after watching the video the first time. I think I wouldn't have liked her being ad hominem or having people like call her names. Mm-hmm. But understanding the arguments she's trying to make better now, I'm like much more upset by how kind of viciously she's being strawmanned and attacked in some cases. And so I just want to read you a couple of the comments that I found. So if you go to the YouTube video, the James Franco video, like generally YouTube will tend to sort it by how many upvotes or thumbs up. It wasn't doing it for me, so I had to kind of skip around. But certainly the number one comment was from a bishop, Bishop Robert Barron. I just say his name because it's right there in public. He says, "That is perhaps the stupidest argument ever made in the public forum. That this lady is a professor of anything is an indictment of our entire educational establishment." 832 thumbs up.
Wow.
Next person, the next, I think most upvoted, this is 267 upvotes. I think it's pretty safe to say that this woman was a diversity hire.
Whoa.
Ooh. That makes me so angry.
Yes.
And 267 people read that and clicked thumbs up. Wow. Or maybe more, because I don't know how many people I think I'm only seeing if like 100 people downvoted and 367, then you see 260. I think that's the way that works. I'm not sure. I know it's the way it works on Reddit.
Do you think the person meant diversity hire as in they wanted a woman on staff?
Either that or I'm not sure what ethnicity C is, but I think it could be an ethnicity thing too. I'm not sure.
She doesn't look super Caucasian, but I'm not good at figuring out
I
people's
don't know.
ethnicities.
I don't know, but no matter how they meant it, if it was an ethnicity or a female thing, it makes me very angry because it's reinforcing this horrible stereotype of pro-life people as hateful.
Yeah.
I mean, that person is being hateful, but I'm upset. Keep going.
Okay, another comment. Proof that liberals are you-know-what crazy. 191 thumbs up. Someone else said, laughing my butt off. Didn't know I'd see the day where James Franco mastered ethics and philosophy more than a university teacher. Ha ha. 173 upvotes. God, anytime that you actually think that could possibly be true. And then there's a couple of the more common straw men. Someone said, basically, if someone is murdered, we shouldn't worry about it because clearly they ran out of moral status. It's not what she's saying. It's not at all what she's saying. It's 88 thumbs up. And then the last one, and this kind of goes to the straw man that I'm so glad we made it really clear how this is not true. But this is some, and I saw a lot of the comments on Facebook from pro-lifers basically saying this thing. Future mother, I want to have this baby. Baby equals moral status. 1 minute later, future baby killer. Oh, I didn't even notice the first time I grabbed this. He says future baby killer in this case. Actually, I don't think I can do this. I want an abortion. Baby equals non-moral status. 1 minute later, future mother. No, I can do this. I want this baby. Baby equals moral status. 1 minute later, future baby killer. Just kidding. I don't want this thing. Baby equals non-moral status. And he ends by saying, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Thank you for educating me. Not what a retard. Wow. So I'm just really upset. And I know these aren't all pro, and I'm just going to respond to the things that you're thinking right now. Okay, I know these are YouTube comments. So I know YouTube comment, the YouTube comment place is everyone knows it's a vile place of iniquity. I get that. But these are comments from people who are against abortion. There was one YouTube comment from someone who was like, I'm pro-choice, and this is still the stupidest thing I've ever heard. So there was at least there's one of those. But generally, these are people who are saying, as someone who, they didn't all use the phrase pro-life or whatever, but people who are arguing against her, these aren't just all liberal college students, People who think abortion is wrong, arguing against her in public, calling her some of the worst names, that you can call her. I mean, I've censored. I stopped grabbing them after this because I've read dozens and dozens of other ones, and some of them were a lot worse than this. But this alone, this anti-intellectualism, this, clearly we're so much smarter than her, and she's a joke and a diversity hire, just pisses me off at a level that I don't even know what to say other than I'm really upset. There's probably some really good point for me to make right now that would be helpful and substantive, and I don't know exactly what it is besides obviously don't be like this. So can someone say something that would be helpful?
This reminds me of a tweet I made a while back, and I said something along the lines of, if a mic drop is fitting at the end of your sentence, it's probably not persuasive or something like that. And I stand by that. like, oh, this was so helpful. Not. Mic drop. She's a diversity hire. Mic drop. It's just like not helpful. I don't know. And I understand the people were angry, but I just want us to be able to say they're wrong without us saying they're an idiot.
Yeah. And you know what's frustrating is that is always going to be more popular than what we do.
Yes.
Like we were talking about this a bit earlier today. Like, even if we had been, had the kind of staff that it would have taken to make a really quick, 5 or 10 minute video, I don't know how, but if we had figured out a way to do a 5 or 10 minute video of this 2-hour long podcast, and we had done it and we'd released it like the same day, it certainly wouldn't have gone viral the way it seems like the pro-life movement is right now, as far as I can tell. As far as like to think about how many likes and how many shares a lot of the responses and things got to this thing, it makes me bothered. Like it's not just like obviously right now we have a smaller platform than a lot of other groups, and I get all that. But that could change. But like right now it seems like people get so excited by being able to jump all over what they think are stupid pro-choice people. It just feels like this is not good. So, again, trying to be fair, Professor Harman did not explain herself very well in this video. And so at least some of that misunderstanding is on her.
Sure.
The kind of vice, the kind of blood in the water, let's jump on her and demonize her and parade her through the town square and laugh at her all together, kind of attitude is exactly the kind of thing that's really on my mind these days. The way social media is evolving, and it's a weird and new phenomenon that is continuing to evolve, is really, really scary to me. And it's hurting dialogue. It's causing people to become more and more vicious, more and more unvirtuous. And I don't know how to fix that. And the fact that that's the case, there's a self-perpetuating kind of cycle to it. The fact that there's this, let's jump on people and not listen to them, means it's a lot harder for people like us to reach them and say, no, like, let's try to be charitable and listen to them, because no one wants to listen to that. And I think some of that has to do with personal vice. Some of that, like, I'm trying to be as charitable to them as I can be.
Yeah.
And some of that is the structure of the medium. The structure of the medium of Facebook, and how quickly you jump from one video to the next, doesn't lend itself to critical, careful thinking. The fact that we have platforms like Twitter and Facebook, where you've got, it's just easy to haha, here's this argument, haha, here's this argument. And the fact that you currently have an increasingly polarizing community in America, where you've got conservatives want to post the aha, look how stupid liberals are videos. And part of that's because they're so frustrated from all the aha, look at how stupid conservatives are videos that they're getting from the other side. And so what you have is this growing blood feud between the two sides. And it doesn't matter who started it. Like we can't identify who started it. But what we have now is a blood feud where there's always, well, I'm going to keep on doing this because I remember the time that they did it to my tribe. Well, you did it to my tribe. And I'm just looking here and be like, guys, can we get over the blood feud?
Yeah.
And have some, like, treat each other better than this? And neither side is willing to do that right now. Like, I'm a generally conservative person who can't stand Trump, but doesn't want to jump on the bandwagon of hassling Trump even when he says dumb things, because I'm so frustrated with the tribalism on Facebook, and I just don't want to join into it.
Right.
And so that all that to say, we have a massive problem on our hands at a society level of how we're interacting with information. The medium is the message here. And some of that, these YouTube commenters aren't responsible for. They are put in this frenzied place where they have this constant fighting is happening.
Yeah.
And that puts them in a mental environment where they so desperately want to have ammunition to throw the other direction. And that's still not good. And I really wish they wouldn't do that. But this is what happens when you stir up a mob. And what Facebook and Twitter and all of the way that culture is interacting right now, like, we're not all physically in the same place, like a mob that's going to go run through a city and steal things and break things. We're all in our homes, on our smartphones or on our computers, and we're all a mob together in that environment.
And you can't reason with a mob. The mob is not able to be reasoned with. They're in the kind of mental state where all they can understand is I'm angry, I'm pissed off, and I want to break stuff. And if you can't break stuff, break windows in an actual riot, you try to say nasty things online.
Yeah, and part of why I'm so upset is because while you can't reason with a mob can still really, really harm people. And
Yes.
I am so
This is
afraid
really harmful.
of Harman going and reading those YouTube comments and the effect that would have on her. You know, having read John Ronson's book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which I don't necessarily endorse because it's got some inappropriate stuff in it. You know, people got to decide what they're going to read or not. But I think I'm glad I've read it and it's affected me. You know, learning what it's been like for people who have had to suddenly deal with this very new phenomenon in humans' experiences of every once in a while having to deal with hundreds or thousands or occasionally hundreds of thousands of people calling you names or saying that you're a horrible person. Like Harman's
that is a traumatic
in that camp
thing
right now.
Yeah.
Is so much more traumatic than people think. And I'm sorry, every single person that upvoted some of these YouTube comments that are literally calling her names, you're all culpable.
Like maybe you think if she was in the stocks in your town square 1,000 years ago, you wouldn't throw a tomato at her, but upvoting those comments, that is the modern equivalent of throwing a tomato at her.
Yeah.
Like that's what you're doing. And so get off your high horse. You're not that special. You're not that woke. You're not that enlightened. You're just like every other mob there's ever been.
Yeah. Don't do this. Once again, we're not saying don't ever use Facebook.
Mm-hmm. I use Facebook.
But probably the result of for the average pro-lifer, and this might not apply to everyone taking a course. I know a lot of the people who are taking our course are already kind of mentally more with us than some of the people that we're talking about. But I think a natural result would be people posting less often, posting fewer comments, and spending more time kind of processing and thinking through something before posting it. Certainly there would be a lot fewer caustic comments, but I think that's a good thing. I think that the person writing this long thing, 1 minute later, 1 minute later, 1 minute later, this person's a retard. Like what I would want that person thinking is this actually going to be helpful? Is this going to be helpful to the people who read it, or is this just me getting off? Is this just me trying to make myself feel smart and good and funny and clever, and everyone else can kind of see that I'm being smart and funny and clever? You know, or worse is if he's actually getting a little bit of like excitement about maybe actually hurting this person that they're talking about. Like, hopefully that's not what's going on. But I'm frustrated. I really do think that this is a good movement, that there's a lot of good in the pro-life movement. I think about 40 Days for Life and sidewalk counselors. There's so many, and I think I just need to spend some time in the next week thinking about the really good stuff in the movement, because I just saw a whole lot of the worst of our movement, and just don't do it. Don't be like that.
Yeah. A natural response that some people might have is, but the other side's doing it. Like they're using social media as a weapon against us, so we need to do the same thing, fight fire with fire. And I feel like it's important to think of it in terms of an angry mob. Like, I think the right response to an angry mob that is starting to form is to try to defuse the mob, not try to direct it to burn down the other guy's city, right? So I'm thinking about...
we need to have our own mob.
Right. So there's a book called Xenocide by Orson Scott Card, which is one of the sequels to Ender's Game. And he has this really incredible description of the process of a mob forming, and one of the individuals like intentionally stoking it and like feeling the power before him as he says something and everyone says it back to him, and like they're moving with me, and I'm like the head of this organism. And I think when you have an angry mob that's forming, don't try to be the head of the organism. Don't try to stoke the fire, and don't try to use that to burn down places that you don't like. Like we've got to diffuse this.
Yeah.
And the way social media is acting right now, it's more like that character in that book, where let's try to stoke the anger for our own political ends because we're tired of it being stoked against us. Like, no, like we all need to be the bigger person here, and diffuse the anger and treat people virtuously.
And go back to persuasiveness. If that principled argument is enough to do it for you, think pragmatically. As a if I was a pro-choice person and I read Matt Anderson's piece or Cerise's piece, I would have been much more impressed with the pro-life movement if that was like my one exposure to pro-life response was I happened upon that. I would have been so much more impressed by the pro-life movement than if I read the YouTube comments or basically every single other thing that I've seen from pro-lifers on Facebook about that video. And so what if, like, let's just imagine, let's just get John Lennon playing in the background. Imagine if the entire pro-life movement acted like Matt Anderson. What if we could have such a much more persuasive movement?
Yeah.
So there's hope. There's reason for a hope, but it's going to be really hard because this way of talking about stuff is way less sexy. But it's certainly a lot more persuasive to the other side.
When you listen to this, maybe send Josh an encouraging message about about like the good things that are happening in the movement. It's not all bad, but it is. It's really hard when things like this happen. And I've been pretty frustrated with social media and mob mentality and kind of the state of that part of our society for the last couple of weeks too. It's very, very easy to get down, and let's try to not go too far into the mire of depression, and maybe good stories will help pull us out.
Well, to close this out, I want us to collectively give a high five to Rachel.
Yes.
Because Rachel did something really special that I want to brag on her just a little bit because I like bragging on how great Rachel is.
He does.
Rachel, you really do. Rachel had a different experience than I did watching that video. Like, it took me reading the paper twice to get a sense that, this is actually a pretty interesting non-circular argument. Rachel figured that out while watching the video the first time. That's incredible.
Yeah.
And I'm so excited that Rachel's on this team that can help push us in a way that I wouldn't have. That can help kind of, hey guys, let's take a second look at this. Like this thing that basically almost the entire pro-life movement thinks is ridiculous. Like, push us towards, let's take a closer look. I think maybe if we read her paper, there might be something more here. And so I salute you, Rachel. And I'm so glad that you're on our team, because the fact that you figured that out while watching the video the first time is incredible to me.
And it's the reason this podcast happened.
I'm just really skeptical about everything I see. I'm kind of just, hey, what are you doing there? Hey, stop that, put that down. I just I'm just really paranoid. I don't know. But I mean, I wish that when we talk about, our platform and what we're able to do, I wanted to make a blog post when this first happened, and because of life circumstances with me support raising and just the depth of this whole topic, that wasn't able to happen. But hopefully in the future, we'll see more of that. And I just want to say that this isn't the last time that something like this is going to happen.
Yep,
and
true.
So I know we've talked, a lot about what these people online are doing. And even the people that are listening to our podcast right now and taking the course, I know that there are probably some of you out there who might have been less charitable than you now wish you would have, or something like that. But we can move forward with, doing something different next time.
If you're really excited about Rachel too, and you want to support her work, she's only about 50% support raised. Literally, you should be excited about her. So if you want to support her work, you can go to ecorightsinstitute.com/donate. If you click on the donate button, you're going to eventually have the option to choose who you want to gift it to, and Rachel is on there. Imagine what Rachel could do if she was full-time in the office in Charlotte instead of spending a lot of her time right now trying to raise her support so she can do this work. Sorry, that's pretty shameless, but she's awesome, and there are a lot worse places that you could put your pro-life money than helping Rachel to help the pro-life movement.
Thanks, Josh.
That's true.